welcome to the Nantasket Beach Lecture Series. I'm Victoria Stevens, the Executive Director of the Hull Life Saving Museum. And as many of you know, this series is co-presented monthly with the Department of Conservation and Recreation and the Friends of Hull Public Library in partnership with the Nantasket Beach Resort. And I'd also like to thank our friend Greg Bennett from Hull Cable, who films these series and makes it available to a wider audience. So thanks. Started with tonight's topic. So we are thrilled to have Bob Gallagher here from the Scituate Historical Society. Bob grew up in Scituate and spent much of his youth around Scituate Harbor. He's a teacher of history and government at Marshfield High School. And when the Scituate Historical Society was looking for a resident caretaker for Scituate Lighthouse, he was the perfect fit. So he lives there with his family now and is the chair of the Scituate Historical Society. And as you'll see in some of the pictures, the Etrusco ran aground almost on top of Scituate Lake. Couldn't have been much closer. So he's done a lot of research on that topic. So Bob, thanks very much for being here tonight.
I'm going to try this unless I can do this. Do you have a preference? Do you rather have the microphone? Oh, then we will. Okay, I am a history teacher at Marshfield High, and I have been for almost 20 years now. I've been at the teaching part of this game. And we've been at Scituate Light, my wife and daughter and I, was 8 full years on Valentine's Day. And it's been quite a run. We've seen quite a lot of changes in the beach, as I'm sure you guys see over here. And we've got the Army Corps coming out, maybe to do a little help, give us a little help and repair one of our jetties in the spring, and that'll be a big project that we try to chronicle. I do have a blog that I keep if this is something of interest to you. It's Old Scituate Light. If you put it through just about any search engine, will come up second or third. And there are a number of cameras there that will give you a picture of the length of the jetty or looking back into the harbor. There's a panoramic camera that's terrific that was donated by one of our local families in memory of their dad. So I encourage you to check out the blog. And I don't get on quite as often as I used to. It seems like the news is it's much more commonplace of late, I guess. Let's put it that way. Things have settled down, but the pictures I still put up, people usually get a kick out of. So I hope you try to take advantage of that. We're talking Etrusco, and it'll be 61 years next week that Etrusco came ashore on Cedar Point, and change, as it says, was all around in my slide. So in '56, we've got America going through a big change. In every facet of life, habits of many generations were being set aside. This was no less true of Scituate when Etrusco grounded. Lots of places, lots of little towns, Hull, Scituate, Cohasset, Hingham, all of these towns were going through a lot of change. So here we see Nikita Khrushchev taking over for the horrible Stalin, one of our first TVs, and The King and I. I'm sorry, that's not The King and I, that is My Fair Lady, thank you. These are some of the changes, and we'll come back to these kind of things as we go through. An example, February 23rd, '56, Martin Luther King Jr. was indicted for his participation in the Montgomery bus boycott. And here's the state of Alabama swearing out its complaint. He presented himself at the county courthouse and was released on bond. We see in '56 the beginnings of lots and lots of changes in civil rights that these little suburbs will see a big result of. Basic facts of the grounding are these. A ship in ballast is turned away from Boston. It's become my running punchline that it was a bad idea to be an Italian ship on St. Patrick's Day. Attempts to push out to sea fail, and the ship finds itself tossed ashore. Townspeople and authorities behave brilliantly to rescue the crew, and the salvage operation begins this amazing transformation of what is a pretty small town in 1956. Yes?
What's the meaning of in ballast?
Empty. All right, if you're in ballast, you haven't got a cargo, and this is going to have it's going to lead to the ship being unable to control its fate.
So that's not normal.
It was coming for a cargo. They asked to be allowed into Boston Harbor. The harbor pilots told them that it was too dangerous for them to board and bring them ashore, and recommended to the captain that he tried to make it out to sea. He wasn't able to because he was bobbing like a cork on top of the ocean. And this was a horrific storm, as you'll see in some headlines here in a minute. This was no run-of-the-mill blizzard. And there'll be one a week later that's even worse. So I'm going to continue. We'll bring some of that stuff forward. The shipwreck was not the first time this happened at Scituate Light. Going all the way back to the 1850s, we know that the ship Elizabeth washed up right in front of right precisely where Etrusco did. In 1886, we have a rescue there of 8 men in a time when there was no keeper on the station. One of the stories of Scituate Light that I tell quite regularly is, for as much as we love it, and we dearly love it, it never worked. From the minute it was turned on, there was request after request to turn it off. And it was on from 1811 until 1849. The first mine its light was in place. First mine its light collapses in April of 1851. Scituate Light is brought back into service. And then in November of 1861, when our current mine at light is brought on service, Scituate Light is retired. And it's not lit again until 1994. So there was no keeper. The keepers there were tenants, but there was no keeper at Scituate Light in the 1886 storm. Portland Gale, we find the pilot boat Columbia only a few yards from the lighthouse, and even the wreck of the Kenwood in 26. This is dangerous ground to ship. I even had one from Ballew's pictorial. Some of the ribs of the Elizabeth found. This is Scituate Light, and they find these ribs precisely where Etrusco lands. Here's our breakdown. I'm in the way, I guess. Here's our breakdown of the 1886 storm. You know, in the abandonment of Scituate Light, they're writing here, their editorialized, was in no way reasonable. They wanted a light there badly. Here we see the pilot boat Columbia from the 1896 storm. It was turned into a tea house for a time. And we have elements of it at the Maritime and Mossing Museum on the Driftway in Scituate. Here's Kenwood, a lumber schooner. There are cottages in my neighborhood that were built with the lumber from the Kenwood. And here's a shipwreck I had in 2011. Rookie sailor takes himself out on an especially windy day and finds himself calling sea tow. So here are some of the first headlines from Etrusco. 30 rescued from ship at Scituate, Italian freighter blown ashore in blizzard. And it was quite a storm, and here are some more of the headlines. 4 destroyers beach in storm. Storm perils 6 ships. The grounding was covered everywhere, all over the United States, and it's really indicative of how much smaller the world was becoming. You know, so in 56, we've got a town of less than 8,000, and stories are being, you know, this being covered in Ottawa, being covered in Lewiston, Maine. Oh, somehow we're going backwards. There we go. Try one more, if you would. There we go. Spokane, Washington. They get a lot wrong. They tell us that the ship capsized, which it did not. And that's Daytona, where they got it wrong, so badly wrong. Next, please. Problems posed by Etrusco were complicated by an even worse storm a week later. So I had students speculating all day that we might be off tomorrow. And I had my fellows, right now our final school day is in fact a Friday. And so if we're out tomorrow, there'll be people coming back after a weekend in June. I don't mind. I run summer school. I'm there all day long. You know? I don't go home. So it's really not an issue to me. Though I did get my first email from somebody who wanted to know when summer school began. I thought, there's somebody who's thrown in their hat already. If they think they're coming to see me in July. A week later, so the 23rd of March, there was this horrific storm. It saw 116 dead in a second blizzard all the way across the United States. If you'd go next, please. A guy named Mike Hammer. He's a local guy, lives down near Scituate Harbor, and he was a Coast Guardsman who served in the rescue team, and he shared with us his scrapbook just prior to the anniversary. So here are some of his images from that book. In this image, we see a lot of the gear they brought out in the very difficult conditions. Right? This storm came in fast, a couple of feet of snow in a very short period of time, and the Coast Guard was up against it. It was complicated further by they lost all power in their headquarters. One of the technicians who became involved in this, a radio guy, actually did the old trick of taking the wrapper, the silver in a pack of gum and putting it behind the fuse to bring your lights back up at the Coast Guard station, if you would. Here we see a few more of the images, including the breeches buoy that they used to bring people off. It was one of the very last times that they used that tool in a rescue. Coast Guard, anyway.
Are the guys on the left Italian?
In some of these guys here are, yes, you can see a little bit of a beret, and we have much better pictures you'll see in a minute. Here, oh, in the left, no, some of those guys were Coast Guard workers, cadets, I guess. Right? They were running up, they kept pulling these different lines out. The great concern initially was that the ship would tip over onto the beach. And through luck, and it would take a little more context than I have time to give you, but it's in a tremendous field of stone still, and it just bounced up and down on that field of stone until it came to rest. So here's Kevin Walsh as an assistant to a Brockton Enterprise photographer named Bauman. Mr. Bauman's photographs are a remarkable resource for this period in our local history. They're stored at Stonehill College, and you have access online to them if that's of interest to you. And Kevin Walsh was his assistant. He actually came to our anniversary dinner and brought some much, much better quality images than we had, including these. Next, please. So here again, yeah, that's the beret. I think we could see not as well in the other picture. And here's the text that's on the back of that image. Crewman from the grounded Italian freighter Etrusco is brought safely to the beach by Coast Guardsmen in breeches buoy rescue operations. The freighter was thrust onto rocky Scituate Beach in a New England blizzard with winds blowing at 60 knots and abnormally high seas on March 16, 1956. Next, please. Review of these headlines in the scrapbook that I find myself considering the other issues that were competing. So Tales of Etrusco were finding alongside stories of Malenkov denouncing Stalin and Khrushchev coming to power in the Soviet Union. This is from Milwaukee that had a headline of it on Etrusco and this story from the Soviet Union. Next, please. So the 25th, Nikita Khrushchev had denounced Joe Stalin during his time as chairman. It set off this reverberation that the Cold War was going to enter into a brand new place because Stalin was gone and Khrushchev had emerged from this troika that had been running the Soviet Union. And it's going to connect later on to events in Berlin and Cuba with this change. World got a little safer and a little more dangerous at the same time when Etrusco was coming up on the beach. Next, please. On a more positive note, 4 days prior, Elvis Presley released his first album. All right. So 2 days later, My Fair Lady debuts, and this is actually a picture of Elvis Presley on stage, March 17, 1956, with the Dorsey Brothers stage show. Two television staples. All right. And I didn't know what kind of connection we might have here tonight, but in my earlier presentations of this, I was actually able to play a little of this. So you could hear the theme music that you might remember from these cutting-edge soap operas. Early April 1956, As the World Turns in the Edge of Night. Next, please. 3 days after the wedding of Princess Grace, Elvis has his first #1. And I don't think it's unreasonable, and I've had people tell me this is so, that a lot of the radios on a lot of the cars making their way to Cedar Point all through that summer were playing Hound Dog or Heartbreak Hotel. This one ended up with a big sing-along. This was my mother's favorite song. And we had a lot of Que Sera, Sera belting through a Methodist church just about a year ago. It was really fun. This was a big one for my mother. She was graduating from high school, and nobody liked Doris Day like my mom. Very big in '56. Change was pressed down in a lot of towns like this, and for 18 years, Scituate had been asking to build a new high school. There had been call after call after call. This was part of another set of research that I had done in this building. It's just turned 100 last year and is soon to be retired for the sake of a new school. And we did a little history retrospective. Our society turned 100 just as this school was turning 100, and we put the pair together and tried to tell both stories. And in doing that, I found out that the school department had been looking for a new school for 18 years. 5 years after Etrusco, it opens. That pressure, that change was coming really, really fast. The growth of the town was so profound it could no longer be put off. Next, please. David Ball, who is really the source for all of this. His book is along with he's our president, and our vice president is Fred Freitas, and they wrote a book called Etrusco, Cradle to Grave. And when David and I were putting together a talk on World War II that we gave and the impact of World War II on Scituate, we found out that I had a chance to interview a woman named Beryl Denker. And her father was one of these teams of radio guys that were volunteers, part of a civil defense group in the 50s, and who came out that night and really did carry the ball for the Coast Guard. Coast Guard equipment was failing. These guys had radios that they'd been trained on, and Buster Sylvester in particular was on all night long coordinating a number of different people, including Jim Howard and Wayne Kessler, Mr. Gammons, Mr. Bates, in different locations. They were the communication web. They were all pretty young guys, and Mike Hammer's scrapbook included this clip that we didn't know we had. I didn't know it existed, but it says they were the unsung heroes, and we marked that contribution and their contributions to another Scituate landmark by placing a stone last summer with a relief of Etrusco carved into it outside the light. I can't tell you the number of people have their pictures taken with it. And we marked, we noted, the Howard family, in fact, raised the money for it. We noted their contribution that night, and you'll see some other images of Jim in a minute. So here's Jim Howard in Mrs. Russo's kitchen. You'll find out more about Mrs. Russo in a minute. But he came with this radio, and he had come out of the movies. And his dad had said, "You might get your kit. I'm going to take you over there." The snow was deep enough that his father couldn't take him all the way in and had to drop him off at the top of the point. And he walked in carrying it's not that big, but he walked in carrying it against the wind, which I've done, against good sense. Been out there in these storms, and set up in Mrs. Russo's kitchen, was there all night, back and forth to the ship. They figured out very early that they were being, the crewmen were using flags initially, and then once he had a radio, they were able to communicate and assure them that they were where they were. They didn't know where they were. It was about 8 o'clock at night that they came aground, and the storm just got worse and worse, and it wasn't until about 4 in the morning that they got them off. Rescued seamen find warm Scituate haven. And Lena Russo, in our neighborhood, the house has been owned by a number of other people since, but it's always referred to as Mrs. Russo's house. I can't get it out of my head when I look out the window. She took this group in and happened to speak the dialect that they spoke. She was about 69 years old at the time, and as it says here, had 31 breakfast guests from the old country. Right. There were other families in the neighborhood as well, and I don't like to slight them, but the Howlands and the Arenas, they took people in as well. So I like to give them their due. But Mrs. Russo will be the person decorated by the Coast Guard for her role in this. And she brought them in and made them welcome. Next, please. So here they are in Mrs. Russo's house. If we go one more, this is our captain. He was very reluctant to leave the ship. He was really concerned about the trouble he was going to be in. There was a fair amount of correspondence with the captain and local officials in Scituate and the Coast Guard. After the event, he had to convince them back home that he hadn't abandoned ship, and he did take some heat for it. The story comes back to us because there's a operation out of South Boston called the Boston Seaman's Friends Society. And a gentleman arrived at the Maritime and Mossing Museum on a Sunday and brought this flyer in and asked, was there anybody there that knew anything about Etrusco? And they were put in contact with David Ball, and it turns out this gentleman was able to connect us with the youngest crewman. And Dave had a 2-year correspondence with Giovanni Belfiore, and another trustee, a friend of ours named Tom Hall, actually went to Italy and interviewed Mr. Belfiore. And my hope is that this summer, adding to the display that we already have on Etrusco outside, that I'll be able to add some technology in that would allow you to come up with your phone and click a little something and actually see these interviews on your phone. That's my hope. I'm trying to make it field trip friendly for the teachers. Here is Giovanni Belfiore's sailing papers. He was 19 years old. If we go one more, please. And here he is with Mrs. Russo. And he spoke of her very warmly in the interview that Tom did with him. Remembered quite well how kind she was to him. He claimed to be the first person who saw the red light, which is the official signal at the end of our North Jetty. He said it was about 8 o'clock. They knew the kind of trouble they were in. They weren't able to go out to sea. And I saw the red light, and I told the captain, he says, in his somewhat broken English. And then they worried about whether they would tip, pardon me, until he finds himself in very good hands of Mrs. Russo. Next, please. And here he is in 2004. Striking. He's passed. Here are some other wonderful images that were shared. These were in a folder, and our archivist handed them off to me and saying, I don't know what these are, but will you find out? And these turned out to all to be images of Etrusco that were taken by this Stanley Bauman. And we've somehow had the negatives. Mrs. Russo celebrated by the Coast Guard, and Kevin Walsh brought us this one. We have that plaque. The Russo family donated it to the Maritime Museum. Also seen in this photograph is a flag that has since been donated to our museum. It was given by the crew of Etrusco to CWO William Miller. And it came down in his family, and another one of our trustees, Allison Short, was able to contact them through the miracle that is Facebook and negotiate through Facebook so that this flag has been returned. Had one more up for me. There, nope. There we go. She's got it. There we go. So at the same time Mrs. Russo was recognized by the crew, this flag was given to the Coast Guard, and it's since been returned to Scituate, where we were really, really grateful to include it. It was actually donated to us on the event where we dedicated this relief, this stone, to Jim Howard and to the others. We're thrilled to get it, and it looks great. It's a great addition for us. Next, please. So here we have some images of Etrusco, and you get the sense of the scale of it. Yeah. So I go up quite regularly to the top of the light. It's me against the spiders, and I like to win. So I go up a lot, and I never go up that I don't look to my left and imagine that ship there. And I really encourage this so much among my students and anybody that has an interest to try to develop what I refer to as that historical imagination. You know, beyond the two dimensions of just seeing the picture, smell the oil. The selectmen put up $500 to clean it up. I don't think it was enough. There are neighbors who still say they have oil in their house from Etrusco. All right, but hear the clanging of the lines, hear the grinding of the rocks. You know, the extent to which you can make it, you know, bring the senses in, makes all the difference in rich and deepening your feel for the event. The light was not in service. In fact, the tower was only a few years away from being condemned. There's images from the 60s, home movies from the family that lived there, where you can see that the tower had been condemned. Here you have a nice shot of the ship. Next, please. And there's, it gives you a sense of Cedar Point. And so it's right up, sitting up tight, and there isn't much of a berm there. People were able to walk right out. Yes?
How long was the ship?
It was 430 feet. It weighed 700 tons. And it was empty, which was the problem. I have an image at home, a cousin of mine, I moved in the light, and my cousin and my aunt and uncle had lived in Scituate in the 50s and moved out in the early 60s. And Joni was still pretty young when they moved out. And I said to her, I just know Uncle Tom took pictures of this thing. There's no way Uncle Tom didn't take pictures of these things. And what's more, he took home movies. He took home movies of everything. So where are they, Joan? She said, I don't know what you're talking about. She'd lived in Connecticut most of her life. This Scituate didn't really resonate with her. So at one point, my sister heard about this back and forth, and she said, Joan, go downstairs. She lived in Westport, Connecticut. Go downstairs, walk straight ahead, and take 2 steps to your right. That's Etrusco. Lee knew where it was in the house. Joni didn't. Next, please. Here's another shot. And one of our few in color. There aren't that many in color. Next, please. And we can go ahead. Here's a good one for the scale. All right. So here's a great one for the scale, and we have several images like this. If you were to come to Scituate Light for a tour, there's the Keeper's Cottage, and we do bring you in, and there's a number of artifacts in there that we try to share and tell you the story of the house and some of the families. And then we have a runway that connects the house to the tower, and in the runway there's a number of things, different stories, and there's a really, really terrific image of the scale of the ship against a 6-foot-tall gentleman who's alongside probably one of the salvagers.
How high was it to the top of the...
You know, I'm going to mess it up. I'm going to say it's 120 feet, and I think I'm really close, but I have to say no one's ever been able to answer that for my satisfaction. But I just try to do it, with I know what our scale is, and so I tried to do it just using a picture, and I came up with about 120 feet. Say that again, sir?
You're talking about the ship?
Yeah.
I think the molded depth on those things were about 45 feet.
All the way to the, to the top.
No, to the top of the hull.
Oh, that wasn't that far. Yeah, these were Liberty ships. I probably should have included that in this. Yes, it was the Fort Poplar. Well done. You've been to this dance before, right?
No, I've read David's book.
You read David's book. This was once the Fort Poplar, built for the Second World War, and then sold, donated, / to the Italians in the aftermath of the war when they did not have a fleet, and returns to the United States as Etrusco. It won't be its last name. We'll continue. And we've got a few more. I like that one because you see the light in it. So the story shifts to one of salvage in these tremendous crowds that will come to see Etrusco. And we add in a few other things that, again, launch us ahead and give you some context. So on June 8th, 1956, Richard B. Fitzgibbon of Stoneham will be the first American serviceman to be killed in Vietnam. And his son also will be killed there 9 years later. All right? This is the pace of this change. A major steelworks strike will highlight the issue of corruption, but also make the Etrusco really valuable. If you could get a ship ashore, it was, or back to sea, I should say, you had real value in that because the steelworkers' strike slowed down production. Chuck Berry hits with Roll Over Beethoven. And In God We Trust becomes the official motto of the United States. It's not that old a thing. July 30, 1956, Jackson Pollock, expressionist artist, died, or abstract artist. The last soldier that served in the Union Army dies. Albert Wilson was 109 in 1956. And the Confederate, just because I knew I would be asked, the last Confederate survives him until 1959. And here's some pictures of those people, if you would. So here we have our lost veterans, Mr. Pollock, Chuck Berry, our Union vet, and In God We Trust. Other milestones, the breakup of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. Fascinating story. I read a book all about it this summer. It was amazing. Amazing book to read. And Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller get hitched. Next, please. And we're going to have to go by this, I'm sorry, because we're not connected in a way to show you, but I will tell you about the Durans. Our current clerk is Alice Duran, and her dad and her uncle did a lot of filming of Etrusco, and it's really quite funny, and you have access to it on YouTube. And what I like best about it is towards the end, they said, when there it goes, should have just blown it up. This story, and here's an image again that gives you the scale, Cape Girardeau, Missouri. And these kids come down to the beach, and we'll see something that reminds us of this before we're done. Here are the crowds. All right. Now, we have open house dates. I think our first one is in May. In fact, I know it is. And people will come, and they come from everywhere. And at some point in each hour, someone will say to me, you know, a bunch of us just jumped in the back of a truck. We had to come down and see Etrusco. You know, my mom came on a date, as I shared earlier. We never did determine if it was with my father or not. She lived in Newton. And my dear friend, Mrs. Palmer, came one day with her grandchildren and said, as I told that story, she said, well, I know I didn't come with John. Her grandchildren got a little cross. And here's some more tastes of this crazy summer. So here, you see, this is actually an image someone took along that windy road. I think this is Stockbridge Road. And again, the connection I tried to make, because I think, to go from, one of the things I encourage with my students is to be able to go from the particulars to the more general and back, is that you're going to see President Eisenhower in that mid-1956 propose the federal highway system that we have today. The target year, this is kind of funny, was 1968 for completing it. The cost was $25 billion. They did complete it in 1993 at $425 billion. Only one stretch of it never built, between Dedham and the North Shore. Who's this? Yeah, McDonald. I guess there's a movie coming out about this guy. Yeah, right? The founder, right? So, again, a big part of it. We had our own founder in Scituate, and his name was Bill O'Connell. And he set up a bus, brought it down the street filled with coffee and potato chips and a few hot dogs, and had himself a summer. The selectmen objected. They said, you don't have a license to be a restaurant. He said, I'm not a restaurant, I'm a van. And if he moved it every half an hour, he couldn't be in trouble. It's a fun interview, and it's posted. We, in the last few months, have created our own YouTube channel. And I was given access to, we just lost a really dear friend who had very much a similar job to our friend here with the camera in the back. My friend Peter was at a lot of things, and we just lost him at 95, and his daughter shared all these tapes, and I've been going through all this work that he did, and one of the really neat interviews is the interview with this guy, Bill, and what did they have to do, and how many chips were there again, and sometimes we took the whole van, and the selectmen didn't care for it, but Bill had himself a good summer. Here's some more of the light. Here's our Admiral, Lebbeus Curtis. He's hired by a team, or a group that assembled, made itself a deal on a cocktail napkin to buy this ship at salvage and get it off the beach. And they brought in Admiral Curtis, who had quite a lot of experience in the Pacific, to get the Etrusco off the beach at Cedar Point. Here you see him on the right in a breeches buoy, and you see him here with one of the folks that had hired him to work. His plan was pretty simple. They were going to dig on either side, create a new channel, and try to turn the ship back to 90 degrees if they could do it, putting sea anchors out at the highest tides and pulling with winches from the deck.
And what month was this?
This we are probably getting late August into September. The selectmen had given them a deadline, and if they didn't figure out what they were going to do, they were going to cut it up right there on the beach. All right, so from Virginia, Spartansburg Herald, this story is being covered. This one's from Arizona. The world kept turning. All right, Harry Belafonte, #1 for 31 weeks. All right, who's the Beyonce of 1956. Right? The first disk drive created by IBM. I teach economics in part along with government and history, and my students are doing a project where they have to create an advertisement for an obsolete product. And I was showing them these old forms of storage today. Babe Dickerson died, the first nuclear power plant, an uprising in Hungary put down by the Soviets, and this spills over to the so-called blood in the water polo game. They're killing each other and trying to drown each other in the Olympics. Early in November, the Etrusco makes it to 90 degrees, and the Nobel Prize goes to the inventor of the transistor. Again, something we very much take for granted, changes the next 20 years. Next, please. Why did I include this? We can't play the clip, but what's happening in October '56?
Don Larson.
This is Don Larson, the only perfect game in the World Series. So here we are. It's getting turned bit by bit.
You said it was November?
November, it comes off the beach. It went on St. Patrick's Day and came off Thanksgiving.
Selectmen gave them till August?
They had, I can't remember exactly what the drop dead date was, but when they agreed that they would do a salvage, the selectmen backed off. But there was a date by which that they hadn't decided they were going to cut it up. Yes?
You said it was 400 feet long.
Yes.
That's 4 football fields.
Mm-hmm. Well, football fields are yards, so it's a little more than a football field. So here you are, and you see these cables coming off the deck. They're not at 90 degrees at all here, so this is fairly early in the process. And this is a hard part of the story to tell, but I do like to tell it because I think it prompts a lot of thinking. Pretty small town. It's about 7,800 people year-round, lots more in the summer, as you guys know here. The economic impact of this was intense, mostly because it put a lot of local guys to work. You know, and it was a company run by a guy named Alan Wheeler, who would later become the president of the Scituate Federal Savings Bank. I can't quantify it, but Etrusco money was multiplied in Scituate in almost every neighborhood of my growing up. Every friend I had lived in a house that was built in part because people came down to see Etrusco, but also because the money was available in these local banks to get your mortgages. You know, I'm totally convinced of this, though I can't really put a number to it. It's one of these, it's really a transformative event in that way. Here you see them working, hauling some barrels around. Here's the action on deck. The bulldozers. This was a neat one. I'm out weed whacking. Right? And weed whacking at the lighthouse should be a 10-minute job. The lawn is as big as your bathroom. But it takes longer because people talk to you. Car pulls up, woman jumps out. Is this where Etrusco was? I said, yeah, right up here. She said, my uncle worked here and he hadn't come over in many years and he ran one of the bulldozers. And my dad did all the explosive work. I said, where are you from? She said, Cohasset. She had never been to the beach. Here we see Admiral Curtis supervising some work along the sides. And you can see they've finally got it a little bit better turned. We're looking at the spindle. They did take a risk one day and got under the skin of the Admiral when they flew the Jolly Roger. Was not met with too much joy. Here we see them coming off. This story is fascinating, and I did not know anything about it, and David does not include this in his book, so I can get one on you back there. Because David didn't know. At the 50th anniversary of the grounding of Etrusco, we had a gentleman whose family was part of this salvage. And he told us of this guy. His name was Gino Brewer. And Gino Brewer escaped from behind the Iron Curtain in a rowboat. and rowed across the Aegean Sea in the middle of the night with a friend of his and came to the United States. It's an unbelievable Cold War story, and finds himself on the beach at Cedar Point trying to get this ship off the beach. They seem to have been able to have a little fun between tides, I'm guessing. They did. Navy sent a blimp down. All right, Mr. Litchfield will help us with this story. Tell us about the blimp.
Well, that's not the same blimp that's my story. My story is about the blimp that crashed in World War II.
I know, and that's why I want you to tell it.
Well, okay, and I don't know if you're familiar with the town forest in Situate.
Here you go. Take that. I love this story.
Right near I grew up almost in Norwell, on the corner of Situate that's near the town forest. I don't know if you've ever driven up that way. Old Oakham Bucket Road and all that all comes together. In 1943, it was July 31st, the Navy was running these blimps out of South Weymouth, and there was a thunderstorm, and one of them tried to make it back to the base, and it crashed. Well, it crashed in my uncle's barn. It's a story nobody knows about because they shrouded it in secrecy for years. I've only found 2 or 3 people that remember it. One fellow was probably about 80 now. He was 15 years old, maybe, or maybe 10. I don't know. But just recently, I connected up with the guys over in the air base that have the little air museum over there. So I asked the guy about it. He had pictures. And he has a picture of the piece of land on where my house that I grew up in. The house was built around me. My dad got the land like 2 years later when he got back from World War II. And I'm looking at this piece of land, and there's 2 lumps there. Well, our house was built between these 2 big boulders, and that's all that's there. And then there's this crashed blimp laying all over the place. Apparently, they actually salvaged it. They, the National Archives has, I think, about a half a dozen pictures on it. The airbase, I think it's called War Wings Art, is their website. And it was called the K-11 blimp, and there's about 6 pictures of it. There's the guy standing in front of it. The neatest one is this picture of it with a blimp over it, and that's where they got the aerial picture of the land where I grew up.
That's what made me think of it, the blimp taking the
It
picture.
was a blimp, it was a blimp just like that.
My favorite part is that somebody was coming back at a birthday party and gone to get ice cream, and they wouldn't let him back to his own house. The ice cream is melting in his hand, and he can't get back to his own house because the blimp has landed on it.
They can't get home for like 3 days.
So here we are finally at nearly perpendicular to the beach. The crowds have thinned out a little bit, and the Admiral goes home. He knows the boat is coming off the beach. You can follow these. There's a gentleman who wrote for the Globe at the time, and he wrote an article every day, and we have all these cataloged. And his daughter was a classmate of Steve's, and she came to the house with their class reunion. And I said, you know, we tracked this story through these articles, through this gentleman. And she said, that was my father. You know about him? I said, absolutely, I know about him. He followed this every day. And he said the Admiral told him it was coming off the beach 3 days later, and away he went. He went home to have his own Thanksgiving.
My dad actually came home that, I think it was the day before, and he said, Procter & Gamble got the Etrusco off the beach. My mother looks at him, we're all looking at him, and said, how'd they do that? He said, they sent down a load of Tide.
We like to tease, if we could go back one, we like to tease that that's the young David Ball, the author of our tale. It's just a big old wave banging up against Etrusco in the middle of a November storm as it came back around. Yes, sir.
Do you have any idea at the time the ship beached what it was worth and what they ended up having to sell it?
4 guys made a deal on a cocktail napkin. They each put up $250,000 and took second mortgages on their homes and did not tell their wives. Mr. Brewer shared that story as he told us the one about his escaped relative. $1 million, and the steel strike played, a big role in it. But they took the $1 million gamble, sitting around a table in a restaurant, and they were able to get the boat off the beach.
Do you have
Yes.
any idea what the ship was worth?
I don't know that I don't know.
Did they all stay married?
Yeah. That's the sequel. Yes, sir.
But one thing that, I don't know if you're gonna bring it out or not, but those ships all carried the fuel in what we call double bottom. So you had 5 or 6 feet between the tank tops and the actual bottom.
You're going to see some holes here in a minute.
So frequently, these ships floating on a tank top. You know, you can get the bottom all stove in, but you'll still stay very much afloat because you're on the tank top.
Yeah, they eventually have to pour quite a lot of cement in it to get something sealed in order to do the initial repairs. If we could.
And so it floated away only to go somewhere to be salvaged.
No, it went away and had some repairs, and I'll take you to the next step in 1 second. We're getting close. So there you go. The gamble written up on a cocktail napkin had paid off, the $1 million gamble. Salvagers ride craft into dock at Boston, batted ship free after 8 months on beach, and here's my man Ray Finnegan, who followed this day after day after day. And Mrs. Russo, because we have a wonderful image of this at the museum, came out on a seawall. I will someday win the Pulitzer for a picture of a wave going over Mrs. Russo's house at that spot where she's standing. I try every time there's a storm, I go up in the tower and say, this is my day. Mrs. Russo came out and waved the ship goodbye and went to Baltimore for its major refitting. 3 days after Etrusco was refloated, the Castro brothers left Mexico, bound for Cuba. All right, Che Guevara is actually in here along with Fidel Castro. November 25th. I love the refloating of Etrusco because it's very much like Ted Williams' last game. There were 10,000 announced and 1 million people there. Every day somebody tells me, "Oh yeah, I was there." We have an event in August, our Heritage Days event, and the first night of it is marked by a luminaria along our coast. And I was out, I guess this goes back 4 years ago, maybe 5 now, and I was lighting my share of the candles. And I began talking with these folks that were sitting along a bench, and one of them said to me, "Do you ever talk about Etrusco?" I said, "From time to time." And she said, "Well, my husband was on it." I said, "Tell me more." Her husband worked with a group out of Woods Hole and come up and been part of the salvage. And he came home to her in the middle of the day on Thanksgiving and said, "The boat's going off the beach and I'm going with it. You have to drive to Boston to pick me up." She was still a little bit miffed that she left a big Thanksgiving dinner on the table. And her daughter was with her and said, "I remember that as a little girl going in and everything was torn to shreds except the captain's quarters, which she said were pristine. Everything else was ripped out." It's neat. I offer this just to show you in large part how much has changed and how much this time was a time of change. So this editorial appears in a Virginia newspaper just as the salvage operation was coming to that was tracking it. It was one of these papers that had a story about Etrusco in routinely. And in this case, Dr. Deborah Coggins was dismissed for having lunch with a person of a different color. And this editorial points out Faith Bissell arrested when she sat down in the section of a junior high school reserved for people of color. And Dr. Browning, county commissioner in Jefferson County in Virginia, "If I'm being fired for defending Dr. Coggins and that's wrong, then it's wrong to be an American." This is the cutting edge for a generation that's going to look at things very differently. It's not just Etrusco coming up on the beach and changing a little town from being a sleepy place to being a jumping place that I grew up in. It's the whole country going through this kind of shift. And I think it offers a bigger lesson or kind of a vehicle for us to look at that. The court cases that follow and the legislation that follows these kinds of stories as that new generation says enough's enough, builds these suburbs as people leave the cities and get away from it. Bill Russell joins the Celtics after helping the United States win the gold medal. Larry Bird is born shortly after that. And Nelson Mandela is arrested in South Africa. Right? This is a time of enormous change. Police Department in Scituate, Chief Kane, notes in the town report just what a challenge this was and how much. I found a neat letter folded into Mike Hammers, who I mentioned, the Coast Guard man I mentioned earlier. There was a letter from a former police officer saying, "Wasn't that a crazy summer? Hope we never see traffic like that again." Signed, this officer, Salvador. School committee report. Parents and teachers appear increasingly reluctant to make a child do the things which they believe to be right. In the home, democratic discussions among all family members have too often become free license in which a child tells off his parents, and the parents appear not only to take it, but to like it. The adolescent desires guidance and needs direction. He feels insecure and confused when decisions are left to him, despite the brave front he may often assume. Parents and teachers increasingly shirk the job of setting a pattern and fail to give them the essential support. We protect, direct, and support the child with physical care. Why can we not, in a like manner, administer to the child's emotional, intellectual needs? There was panic in the streets. I blame it on Elvis. Here's the bottom of Etrusco. If we go back one, I think that's, you can see the damage that rock field did in the course. So here you see that process realized, we think. It goes back to sea as the Scituate. Okay, and Giovanni Belfiore tells the story in this interview that Tom did with him of being on a ship coming out of New York, where he elbowed his crewmate and said, "That's my ship. That's the ship I was on." He said, "You're full of it. You weren't on that ship." He said, No, that was the name of that little town where they took us in. That has to be my old ship." So he saw it again.
So there it says the value goes up to $2 million.
Okay, yep. That's wrong, because I know they paid more than that. That's an error. The newspapers, it turns out then and now. Oh no. Here we have our local selectman, one of the salvagers, and our friend Annie Tilden, still with us, living down in Georgia. And she, if we go to the next one, was able to christen the SS Scituate. All right, a showery christening in December of '56. And there's a plaque noting the grounding of Etrusco alongside the light. I do like this story as well. It was placed by our neighborhood association at the 20th anniversary, and then it was very, very quickly lost, believed stolen. Another one was placed at the 30th. When we had a storm, I guess it was, I call it the Boxing Day blizzard. It was 2010, the day after Christmas. Massive storm. Yeah, big one. All of a sudden, I got a call from the police station saying, "We found your plaque." I said, "I'm not missing one." The plaque, long thought gone and stolen, was between the two jetties. And a father and his two sons and their dog were out walking, and they recognized it, pulled it out of the mud, turned it into the police station. And now that is available to us at the Maritime and Mossing Museum. That's the one, Annie Tilden. Telegram received to the Selectmen of Scituate from SS Scituate, New York Radio. Crew SS Scituate, ex Etrusco on First Atlantic Crossing. Remember friendly hospitality, wishing peace, prosperity to all citizens. The bad news, this underpowered ship, you noted perfectly, this underpowered ship ended up again on the rocks in Hong Kong, where it was eventually scrapped. It was cut up for scrap metal. All right? Shouldn't have been out empty, man. Originally the Fort Poplar, as noted here. And that was the end of Etrusco in the early 60s. It got hung up again in Hong Kong.
How many years then did it run?
It was first in the water, I believe, in 1942, so it got about 20 years. Still another story, and we'll add this in quickly. The spirit, so to speak, that was let loose by this event in town led to the creation of an institution that's still in place called Etrusco Associates. And great numbers of families from all different towns have taken advantage of the services. And if we go to the next slide, and then one more, please. This is actually the ring was donated to the Wheeler family. That's a ring from Etrusco. We have another one that was given to David Ball. He has it in his house. But this is where you go if you need materials to recover from any sort of service. And I'm guessing a number of you know of this or have taken advantage of it. And it's a remarkable thing for this story to continue now into 60 years of this generosity and this attitude that the stranger and the person in trouble will be given the best possible attention. It's a really nice thing to be able to say about your hometown. Getting a little misty.
Isn't that on land that Alan Wheeler donated?
Yeah. And here, if you remember going way back, we had some boys, and that photograph became the model for this painting. I think that's it. All right? And we thank you for coming out on a cold night to listen to old me.